Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Geek Night podcast. I am back with another episode, and this is going to be another insightful episode because I have Arsu with me. Arsu has a vast experience. He's been a developer, he has been an engineering manager. He's worked with companies like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and now currently he's working as a CTO at KBX Digital. So, we are going to talk about career growth, leadership, and productivity with Arsu. So, Arsu, welcome to the podcast. Thanks a lot for joining. So, maybe you can add a little bit more to your introduction, what you have been doing in your current role and your journey.
Sure. Hi, Kaivalya, and hi, everyone. I've had an interesting journey so far, and happy to share anything that I can from my experience so far. As Kaivalya mentioned, early part of my career, the first 10 years were mostly with Microsoft and Google, where it was a lot on technology, growing as a engineer, and towards the end also taking on like managerial responsibilities. As an engineering manager. The next part, around 5 years again, was with Amazon, where it was growing further on the managerial path into senior management roles. Uh, I think the difference there was like transitioning from a people manager of just technology focused team to get into a more roadmap defining and a business planning kind of role. And the next 5 years were in a startup called eShakti, which is into custom made fashion e commerce, where my role was fairly end to end, like looking not just at technology, but also looking at digital marketing, operations, and how do you apply technology in operations and all these other areas to make business impact through technology. So that was the kind of role after that. And recently with KBX Digital, where we are into fintech product development, that's the current role that I'm in. It's been a very interesting journey so far, and happy to have worked with Kaivalya and Amazon earlier as well.
Great, great, great. I am really excited to get all those insights from your experience. So let's get
Mhm.
started. Um, so you have been like an individual contributor, like a software developer, and then you transition into management roles. Um how has been your journey, like experience in the two roles? And with that, I also want to ask you if you have seen some common traits that a successful IC and a successful leader has, eh, like common traits among them.
Right, right. Uh, One thing that I'm a fairly strong believer is in core tech companies. It is tech ICs who need to grow into tech managerial roles. I think that's a statement that Elon Musk had made recently as
Yeah.
well. I'm a pretty strong believer in that for core tech
Mhm.
companies specifically. Uh, and my path was like that as well, like where I grew as a technology person, like as a software engineer, as a senior software engineer, uh, and my aspiration was always to get into the management path and more into a general
Mhm.
management path as well eventually. Uh, and those were conversations that I was able to have with my manager at that point, and had opportunities to first initially like lead small teams, and then formally become a manager. I guess the path eventually was like first to be a people first line people manager, handling a small tech team, guiding them, which was more delivery focused, right? Like it was still a very tech role, focusing on design, uh, code reviews, and things like that, and getting the team to be highly productive and deliver. Uh, and as it progressed further on the managerial path, it was more into roadmap planning, strategic planning for the team, the tech direction that we should be taking, and eventually, like, uh, how do you even build products or impact business through technology? That's been the transition through
Mhm.
this period. Uh, your other question on like the skills needed in both. Uh, One part that the functional skills are important in both, right? Like there's no doubt
Yeah.
about that. Like the core functional skills uh, is the primary skill requirement in both of these. Other values that I would look at is like ownership or like customer obsession, things like that, I think are common in all roles as well. So that's required in both paths. Where the difference starts coming in is as you grow further and further in a tech IC role, the expertise goes deeper and deeper into your functional expertise, and that's where your differentiator
Mm,
comes in, right? Like if you look at the strong principal engineers, it's the wealth of their tech expertise that really adds
mm,
value, right? Like ability to understand a wide range of technologies, understand a wide range of design patterns, and apply it at the right place. Thinking through uh, technology in a very fundamental way, and having the expertise to even make industry level
mm,
impact, right? Like that's the direction that eventually principal engineers get to. So it's more and more depth on the functional
mhm,
expertise. Uh, I guess on the management side, it's more breadth because in addition to the technical expertise, there's a wide range of other areas that managers need to be looking at. First, of course, people management is the initial phase of management that comes in as a responsibility. And beyond that, it gets into like uh, your product, understanding your customer, understanding the product, how the product fits for the customer, building a roadmap and a vision for that, being able to deliver for that, planning resourcing for
mm.
that, and really making a successful product out of
Yeah.
it, right? Like so, it becomes a more rounded and a broader role. And I look at IC as like a deeper
Mm,
role in functional expertise. That's how I think it starts differing as you grow in each of these paths over a period of time. Though the base is common, like you really need to have a strong functional
mm.
expertise to start off with for either of
Yeah,
these.
yeah. Sounds good. So is it fair to say that so if someone wants to become like a successful IC engineer, they don't want to go into people management or technical management, but they only want to focus on the engineering side. So is it fair to say that they should be focusing more on the depth of any technology space as compared to the breadth?
Uh, I think they definitely need to focus on depth of their technical
Hmm.
expertise. And I do think there could be maybe slightly different kinds of uh, principal
Hmm.
engineers for that matter, right? Like you could be a depth principal engineer who is extremely competent in one specific
Hmm.
domain, right? Like, and is an industry expert in that domain, can uh, works quite a bit in that domain, right? Like, I think there's also scope for a breadth principal
Hmm.
engineer. It's not breadth in terms of like different kinds of skill sets beyond technology, but within technology itself, uh, in a broad area as to like having the ability to conceptualize different kind of systems and add design value or like enterprise architecture value to any kind of requirement, right? Like so, I do think there's scope for a breadth principal
Hmm.
engineer as well, who can look at architecture and design for like any kind of requirement versus there's also scope for depth principal engineer who goes very deep into like one particular
Hmm.
technology, like and is in industry veteran and an expert in that particular technology. That's how I'd look at it. What I meant as a breadth in terms of the manager is various expertise beyond technical
Hmm.
expertise as well, like breadth beyond technical
Okay.
expertise.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Uh, do you miss something from your IC roles that times that you don't get to do while being a manager?
I think I do. Like I do enjoy having like good deep technical
Mm,
discussions, like uh, primarily on like modeling
mm,
systems, uh, defining responsibility for a system, or like working on a complex database schema or
yeah.
something like that. It's not something that I get the opportunity to work or even have those discussions often, but I do try and get into those discussions once in
Yeah.
a while just to uh, keep my brain cells active, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Um, so I see. So you're looking at your journey, right? So this is like a ever growing space where you get more and more responsibility, and people expect more and more from you, right? So with that, to keep up to that expectations and to be more and more responsible for more and more things, um, how do
Mhm.
you keep up to date uh, in terms of technology, in terms of the learnings that you do? So how do you keep yourself up to date, and what is the process that you follow? Because for me, for example, when I was like a junior engineer, then I moved to a mid-level engineer. So I had to learn more. I had to build that expertise. So now if I talk about like even like principal engineer or a staff engineer, there are more and more expectations and more learnings that you need to do. So does it come with experience, or there is something that one should care about in order to be updated and be up to that pace?
Yeah, I think learning and having the curiosity to
Hmm.
learn is a fundamental requirement for a good
Yeah.
engineer. Like I wouldn't even say a software
Yeah.
engineer for that matter. Like any
Hmm.
engineer is a builder, right? It's like, and you need to be up to date, whether it's technology or whether it's customer expectations, for example,
Yeah.
right? It's like there are so many things that keep changing, and being up to date uh, is
Hmm.
mandatory, right? It's not an
Yeah.
option to uh, work in what you're already good at and stay with that. So a constant process of learning is always needed. There's no doubt in that. Uh, and engineers should fundamentally learn how to
Hmm.
learn. I think that's the most important aspect. In fact, I feel like that's what your engineering degree has to
Yeah.
teach, right? Like it teaches the fundamentals that make you a strong engineer and sets you a
Hmm.
foundation that enables you to keep learning and going ahead, right? Like, well, I don't think any of us are going to use the technologies that you learned in your
Yeah.
college, uh, in your
Yeah.
career, right? So it's gonna it's so what the engineering degree needs to give us is uh, the ability to learn, right? It's like a very strong grasp of fundamentals, which would eventually give us an ability to
Hmm.
learn. So I guess that curiosity to learn is important. What enables that? One, a strong grasp of
Hmm.
fundamentals, right? Like and I would say if it's computer science, it's like you would look at like your data structures, algorithms, basics of programming languages, how things
Yeah.
work, uh, like what happens when you do something, right? It's like how does front end render on, like how does the front end framework
Hmm.
work, right? Like it's lesser important to know what functions are available or what functionality is available in a specific package, because that's something that you can very quickly find out with a
Yeah.
Google search, right? But it's more important to know how it's working under
Hmm.
the hood, because that's when you really get to know that well and build on top
Yeah.
of that, right? So I think understanding fundamentals is the first and foremost what's important to from an engineer's perspective. Uh, and then the curiosity to
Hmm.
learn, right? It's like wanting to be constantly updated, uh, reading up, like there is plenty of
Yeah.
online material, so there's no dearth of it. uh, Whether it's reading up, whether it's discussing with your peers, uh, online forums, or having a lot of cross
Yeah.
learning, right? Like just and I think that curiosity to learn, if that's there, uh, an engineer would find out ways to keep updated, and it's important to know what's
Hmm.
out there, right? Like so that you know when to get into the depths of each area. You don't necessarily have to be the master of all
Yeah.
technologies, right? Like that's just not going
Yeah.
to be possible. But understanding the breadth of it so that you know when you have to dive deep into some area, that's important from an engineer's perspective. And one thing that I don't believe in is a software engineer saying that, hey, I'm a PHP developer, right? It's uh, you're confining yourself to
Yeah.
something that you shouldn't be,
Yeah.
right? Like when that
Yeah. Yeah.
happens.
Makes sense.
So the fundamentals and curiosity to learn, that's what I look for in engineers. yeah, even when I
Yeah,
hire.
that makes sense. And I think you raised a very good point about, confining yourself to a certain technology. So I also believe
Mhm.
that, as an engineer, we should be focusing more on the patterns, like general patterns, and not certain
Mhm.
technologies. And because that
Right,
technology can become obsolete. And then if
right.
you are not, curious to learn new technologies, it might be a problem. So yeah,
Right.
that's
In fact, just to add on to that, it's not even just about that technology going
hmm,
obsolete. You may not even be an expert in that technology without knowing the
yeah,
fundamentals well,
yeah.
right? It's like, so knowing how things work under the hood and like what this platform really
Mm,
does, that's the key part. And when you understand that, like picking up different technologies is fairly easy.
yeah. I mean, this is so interesting that, the more and more like senior people I talk to, they
Hmm.
tell about focusing on the basics, focusing on the fundamentals, and it's so obvious that, know the basics well and know the fundamentals well, but still
Right.
it's not that, common. So I think
Yeah.
that's a very interesting thing. Uh,
Right.
Great. So let's say, like, so what are your resources to what do you read, for example? Where do you look for to get new ideas and then, dig deep into certain areas? So what are some resources if you could share?
Actually, for me, the biggest resource has been like brainstorming with
Mm,
people. Like in my case, I do read up online sites and all that, but it's like where I think I've really got value is talking to people periodically and getting into technology
yeah,
discussions and just sometimes it's even like hypothetical
yeah.
questions, like just asking like, hey, if I wanted to do something like this, what would be
Mm,
appropriate, right? Like, or uh, have you heard of this thing that AWS announced in reInvent, and where do you think it's going to be
yeah.
useful? Like, or where can we use it in our applications, right? Like, so I think those discussions have been really insightful
Mm,
for me, uh, enabling me to like get a quick understanding of various areas. So that's probably what's worked for me. But I guess it's like everyone has
yeah.
their own ways of getting information. Like uh, maybe for an individual contributor or a senior or a principal individual contributor, maybe actually working or like doing a demo or like getting
Mm,
hands-on in like a pilot project might probably be the best way to quickly understand
yeah.
certain things. Uh, but this is what has worked for me well so far.
Awesome. Yeah. I think I've also experienced that because I mean, of course, I talk to many people because of this podcast. And this is one reason
Mhm.
I love to do that, because there are so many interesting insights and so many ideas that I get from this. But even apart from this, I know that, like, talking to people about certain ideas, about just brainstorming on a whiteboard, that gives you a lot of
Mhm.
pointers to, go back and,
Yeah,
figure out how things work and learn more. So yeah, I totally agree on that. Has COVID
right.
changed that for you? For example, so uh, when it started, so there's like a we used to go to the office and everyone was in the same room and we could, whenever we wanted, we used this whiteboard just to brainstorm. Now it is getting back to normal, but it's still like a hybrid model where a lot of people are remote, or like 2 or 3 days a week they work remotely and then come to the office. So has it changed? What are your thoughts on that? Like,
Yeah, I do think the brainstorming aspect, the hallway
mm,
discussions, and like even overhearing conversations that others
yeah,
are having, by which you learn a
mm,
lot. That part has been
yeah,
impacted by COVID, right? Like, so that is true. Uh, and I do think that's a significant value that we
mm,
lose when people are not in the
mm,
same room, right? It's like, uh, because maybe we'll evolve to like work around that. But I think where we are now is that kind of brainstorming is
mm,
missing in a remote working model. In my case, though, it's because we are in early stage
Hmm.
startup mode. It's we've been pretty much working in
Yeah.
person for quite a bit of
Okay.
time now. Of course, there were disruptions, but for quite a bit of time. So we've not been as
Hmm.
impacted. And I do think it's like when it's early stage, when you need to have a lot of brainstorming and you need to get the team to really connect well and build complex systems, uh, having more face time
Hmm.
helps. So that's been the model that we've been in
Yeah.
for now.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense. So there was so one part of growing responsibility and having more expectations was to keep learning and stay up to date, and the other part is
Mm.
to since you have more things to do, it's about being productive, right? And the more
Mm.
productive you are, the more like the better you manage your time. uh, it's better for you because otherwise you will feel burnout. So how do you be make sure that you are being productive, and what are the tools that you use, for example?
Yeah, so let's take it as two parts, like one on the productivity part and the other on the time management by which you become
Yeah.
productivity, right? Become productive, right? So uh, I think the only way to measure productivity is by team productivity and impact to the
Hmm.
organization, right? It's like I don't think productivity should ever be measured at an individual
Yeah.
level, right? It could be an individual's contribution to team
Hmm.
productivity. Uh, because when I hear someone saying like, "Hey, I've been incredibly productive because I've cut down 2 hours commute and I got like 2 hours of more work," I definitely think that adds value. There's no doubt in that. Like there is value in it. But has that impacted team productivity is something that should be
Hmm.
factored in, right? It's like, and I think in mature teams it would be lesser
Yeah.
impacting, and it could actually be higher productivity when people are in a remote, working in a remote model. But people have the same connect. They're working well together. Uh, they know what they have to do. It's a well-oiled machine. Uh, at that point, maybe it's like there is a very high productive
Hmm.
environment with more hours, people getting and all that, right? Like I'm taking this as an example, but the point is productivity should be measured in terms of team productivity rather than feeling I'm individually
Hmm.
productive, but team productivity could have been impacted because uh, a fresh engineer out of college had nobody to
Hmm.
groom him, right? Like, or uh, brainstorming discussions did not happen as much, so a right tech choice was not taken,
Yeah.
right? Or understanding of requirements were weak, because of which you ended up doing something incorrect and you had to redo it a couple of
Hmm.
times to get it right. So all of these lead to overall productivity drops,
Yeah.
right? Like, and that's something that should be factored in, right? Like, why? So, like, we can't live in a perception of individual productivity.
Hmm.
Productivity should always be measured as like team productivity and output, right? Like, so, and coming to time management, like that's that's one of my favorite areas, uh, and I've been asked this quite a bit of times. There are many ways to use tools to it. And I will get to that as to like what I use. But I think the tool part is actually lesser
Hmm.
important. Uh, I feel time management comes in by a burning desire to accomplish things, right? Or like fantastic gratification that you get by
Hmm.
accomplishing things, right? Like wanting to do things is what motivates you to manage your time better, focus on the most important ones, and getting things done. Always working on priority
Hmm.
items, knowing what is important, what is not important, and knowing how to go about it, right? It's like, uh, should I spend like 2 hours in my morning and get this done before my other things? Like, all of this comes in naturally if you have that burning desire to
Hmm.
accomplish, right? It's like, uh, I guess that's been the biggest motivation to manage time
Hmm.
better. Uh, and if that is not there, the tools don't
Yeah.
really help, right? Like, because the tools are like there to lay things for you, but it can't force you to do those,
Yeah,
right? It's like
exactly.
so. I guess that's the
Mm,
model, uh, and I also think it also depends on the nature of the role to an
mm,
extent, right? Like if it's a very creative role, or if it's a very deep technology role, uh, I'm not necessarily sure whether focusing on time management and getting a lot of things done, multitasking is the right way
yeah,
to do
yeah.
it, right? Like maybe for those roles, uh, you do need a free hand and like be a bit flexible in getting things done. Uh, Whereas definitely for managerial roles where it's like you are on an execution path and you have to get things
Mm,
done, right? It's like your role is to deliver on things and get
yeah,
things done. I think time management becomes a key part, and that's where uh, having that uh, desire to accomplish is the biggest factor. Uh, I think like I use tools like Google Keep. Like it's fairly
yeah.
simple. It gives me like ways to like put in different lists, and I can keep looking at it and know what is the most important one for me to get done. So the tool by itself is it's a pretty simple way to
Mm,
track it, right? It's like every day in the morning, it's take a look at it and look at it multiple times
yeah.
in the day and make sure that the most important ones are getting addressed and keep adding to it. That's how I've gone through it, and it's been helpful. A few other things that have been also useful is particularly with people, right? It's like, and particularly with managers in the
Mm,
team, right? Uh, what's also helpful is not to keep pinging as and when you have a
mm,
question, but more like, and with any senior resource, for example, right? Like not just managers, even if it's a senior engineer, uh, not just calling multiple times a day or pinging multiple times a day, but having a list of things that you want to
mm,
discuss with them, right? Like, and once that comes to a meaningful
mm,
level, or you have like a scheduled meeting, then unless something is like a burning issue that you need to discuss right away, it always makes sense to collate things and work well. It not just helps in your time management; it also helps in their
mm.
time management, rather than like pinging them like 4 times a day on like various things. Hey, where are we on this? Where are we on that? That's been something that it's not something that I was always doing. It's fairly recent, and I think that's also working
Mm.
well. But more than the tools and the processes, really wanting to get things done and like focusing on that, like keeping that as your priority. That's what has helped in this.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, so these are the things that we can control as individuals. So we can be curious. We can make our fundamentals
Mm,
strong. We can be productive. We can manage our time well. We can keep learning and stay up to date. But there are certain things that are not under our control. So uh, there are people, for example, who are difficult. For example, they don't want you to succeed, uh, or let's say they are not ready to help. So the question I want to ask
mm.
is how to manage or how to handle or deal with those people who are difficult.
Yeah. So unfortunately, this happens everywhere, right? And we all face this at some point. Uh, I just feel that just taking off on our previous discussion on productivity, right? Like everyone's focus should be on team productivity, and anybody who's not
Mm,
doing that, I guess that's what you're meaning as like difficult
yeah,
person to work with, right? Like someone who's not, it's not a nice person to work with, right? It's not really adding to the team
yeah,
productivity. I guess, like in my view, that is just
mm,
unacceptable behavior, right? It's like it's completely unacceptable. If you're in a position to fix that, that should be your priority. Like managers should watch out for uh, any instances where people are like not working well together, and see what needs to be done to resolve it. Like if you're in a position to fix that, that should be your
mm,
priority as a manager. Like, and it's very important to proactively do that, because there's no point in like hurting people's morale, bringing down team
yeah,
productivity for these
yeah,
kind of reasons. It's just not. an acceptable thing at all, right? So that should be very clear in every manager's mind, right? Like, so that's one. If it's a peer or like even a boss, uh, it's still unacceptable. I guess it's going to be a case by case basis. Maybe discussing with them if you think that's going to work, or if you feel that that's just not going to work. Like, can you
Mm,
escalate it? Uh, and how do you bring it in a positive way, right? Like, let's say you have a difficult boss and you need to go to your boss's
mm,
boss. What you don't want is it to look as a complaining discussion, right? Like, but what we need is, hey, this is the impact that it's having
mm,
on me and on the team, and this is the end result in terms of productivity of the team or the output that we generate for the company. Uh, I because I guess, end of the day, that's what really matters, right? It's uh, if anyone is impacting the overall output of the
mm,
team, that's not okay, and that needs to be dealt with. If you are in a position to fix it, watch out for it, proactively address it. If not, definitely escalate and report it in a positive way as to uh, like calling out like how it's
mm.
impacting the productivity of the team or the output, and then trying to address it that way rather than just as a complaint, as like, oh, it's like I don't like
Mm.
working with it. That's the way
Yeah,
I look at it.
yeah, that makes sense. So I think being transparent. So if it's not your manager, then I think
Hmm.
talking to your manager and being transparent and being constructive,
Yeah.
I think that should help, right? Okay.
Yep, yep. As long as we are able to call out it in terms of the impact that this person's behavior
Mm,
has on your productivity, your team's productivity, or the team's morale, anything that uh, creates a negative environment and weakens the output of the
mm.
team, right? Like, if that can be called out, I guess anybody would want to address and
Yeah,
fix that, right? So that's what needs to be made explicit.
yeah, that makes sense. Uh, I just recalled one example. So there was a person who wasn't working like within my team, but uh, working with a team who used to work with us very closely, and the person was
Hmm.
like an excellent engineer. He was like a very senior engineer having a lot of experience, but then he used to give those code reviews and they were like really harsh and really like kind of disrespectful, like something like, you don't know anything about this, do it this way, and things like
Right.
that. So I think these things are some way they impact the productivity of the person, like the author of the PR, and also creates like a bad environment within the team. So people might feel,
Yeah.
hesitant to, share ideas, and it ultimately impacts the team's productivity. And I think, as you rightly said, like every manager should be focusing on solving these problems, which impacts the team's health and team's productivity. So yeah, that.
Absolutely. Yeah, being good at what you do does not give a right to be bad to
Yeah.
others, right? So that's just
Yeah.
not okay, right? So it's not okay for a strong engineer to be rude to others or disrespectful
Mm,
to others. Like, it's just not acceptable in a professional
yeah.
environment. And sometimes I guess it just happens out of
Hmm.
passion rather than bad intent. Uh, that's a situation where coaching is needed rather than uh, any major action. So that's how I
Yeah.
look at it. But it needs to
Yeah.
be fixed in any case.
Yeah. I think it might also start right from the hiring part, where people kind of
Mm.
test the behavioral aspects of a candidate, right? Like, if a candidate is being rude, let's say, most probably he is
Mm.
not like created those traits after joining your company. Maybe
Mm.
it's well before that. So focusing on hiring and the behavioral parts is also critical. Um, what do you
Yeah.
think?
That is true. Like the way I would watch out for things like this is like how a person talks about their previous employers or their previous
Hmm.
teams, right? Like, that says a lot about their
Yeah.
attitude towards team and people they work with. Uh, that's like one example of what can be watched out for. That said, it's an interview is still a 45 minutes, 1 hour discussion. So it's uh, you may or may not necessarily catch it in the interview. If you catch it in the interview, these are things to watch out for and definitely important.
Absolutely.
If it's not caught in the interview, it's still important to address if people are in.
Yeah, makes sense. Great. So I think uh, I want to move slightly, towards the technology part of our discussion. So before I do that, let's summarize what we have discussed so far. So I think the key points that you mentioned here was to focusing on the basics and the foundations and be sure that you are really strong in that manner. Um, doesn't matter if you're an IC or a manager, but being strong at foundations is extremely important. Then staying up to date, talking to people, looking at resources, and being curious to learn more is the other thing which is extremely important. Um, Managing time, I think you raised a good point that the tools are just there to help you, but the motivation or the urge to complete things and accomplish something is the first step. And then the tools can of course help you do that. And I think you personally use like Google Keep to um, keep things in a very sorted manner and know what to do first and kind of prioritize things. And then you also mentioned it's about like making the team productive as well, like managing their time as well in a good manner. So instead of pinging them like 10 times a day, it's better to kind of batch things and then ask them at once. And so I think these were the ideas that you shared primarily, right? Did I miss something?
Yeah, that's a good
Okay,
summary.
great. Great. So let's move on to the technology space. So, you have been working in this industry for a long time now, and I'm sure you have seen the shift, like in terms of technology and in terms of this processes that we follow. So, what is the biggest shift for you when we talk about like how the technology space has changed? If we talk about like early, let's say 2000s, and then now.
Yeah, if I look at so I've been working in the industry for like around little over 20 years, and when I look at this, uh, to me the biggest shift seems to have been from business kind of applications to more end consumer oriented
Mm,
applications, right? Like even from technology's perspective, like if you think of developments early on, we used to work on like enterprise software or like commercial products that people use, uh, and most of these software were used in a professional environment in many cases. And then there was a lot of custom development done for like banks or like insurance companies and all of these, right? Like, I guess now the shift has gone quite a bit to the end
mm,
consumer. A lot of development is focused on like mobile apps for end customers, uh, or like ways to sell to end customers, productivity tools for end customers, or like utility, like various kind of uh, like even if you think of like disruption in like digital
mm.
payments and e-commerce, all these spaces, it's all on the consumer side,
Yeah.
right? It's like so that's uh, so technology has moved from just being in a formal business environment to like making life simpler, right? So it was from business efficiency, it's come to like, of course, that's there as well. Like it's, and in fact, I guess it's become more and more in business
Mm,
also. But there's also been a big focus on end consumer application, making life
mm.
simpler, right? Like with your applicant, whether it's to like get a cab or order
Yeah.
food or like shop online, or just utilities or like payments, all of these, right? It's like it's there's been a very big shift towards the end
Mm,
customer, right? And probably uh, that's a general shift because of like smartphones coming in, where you have like practically you have a computer in your
yeah.
pocket when you
Mm,
move around, so your access to like do a lot of things through technology has increased quite a bit, and that's why we probably have this shift, which I guess is a very, very
Yeah.
positive shift. Uh, because I also feel that this move to the end consumer brings in a lot of societal
Mm.
shift, right? Like it brings in a lot more financial inclusion, for example, right? Like with like people having wallets and like easy payment mechanisms. That's like way more financial inclusion than what we've ever
Mm.
had, right? Like in India is probably like in a very strong position in that space with uh, UPI and
Yeah.
all this, where you have everyone has access to uh, an account and a good payment mechanism and a good way to transfer money. Like if you are in a different
Yeah.
country and or like you're working somewhere else and you want to transfer money to your
Mm.
family, or you want to make a payment for something that you just bought in a shop, all these have there's been a lot of innovation on the end consumer side. To me, that seems to be the big shift in terms of where what I saw at the beginning of my
Mm.
career to where I see now. Like the development is not just for business efficiency, but it's to actually make people lives
Mm.
easier on a daily basis. Uh, and all supporting technology for that is also underlying technology needed for
Yeah.
these like have also become popular in this space. But as an industry shift, this is the biggest change that I see during this
Mm.
period.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. And what is the technology space that you think is going to, be the next, big thing in, let's say, coming 10 years, for example?
That's a hard one. So uh, I think I expect technology to become more and more pervasive,
Mm.
right? Like what we just spoke of is also like the technology has like expanded to more target audience and where
Yeah.
it was like 20 years ago. Like, and it's expected to be more and more and for more and more use cases, right? So that's likely to be the scenario. So anything associated with that kind of an expansion,
Mm.
right? Like I think if you think of it in terms of industries, it's it, things that bring in like using technology to bring in more
Mm.
connectivity, right? Like digital payments or e-commerce. These are all like great examples of like connecting a buyer and a seller, for
Mm.
example, or connecting a merchant who needs a payment and a customer who is needing to make a payment, right? Like so, uh, I guess anything that's to do with connecting this, like for example, like if I need a service, right? Like any kind of service, whether
Yeah.
it's plumbing or on the other hand it's actually like medical advice or like healthcare services or bringing access to people anywhere anytime using technology. I guess that's going to be more and more pervasive. Remote work is going to be more and more
Mm.
pervasive. uh, so those are all areas that are likely to increase significantly over the next few years. So all technology that kind of aligns with this are likely to have significant growth. I also feel uh, just in terms of technology areas, I think when technology becomes more and more pervasive, you're going to need a lot of development to be
Mm.
done, right? It's like there is, like I'm sure there's a long tail of applications everywhere that is needed to be
Mm.
developed. And I guess that's where the no code, low code model that's becoming more and more popular now, I think that's likely to become anything that helps the end user uh, build their own
Mm.
technology requirements, right? Like I think that's going to have a big boost
Yeah.
as well, like no code, low code, or like app builder
Yeah.
models. In general, anything that helps uh, me as an end user build small technology pieces that are very specific to my use
Mm.
case or like my family's use case. I think that could be a big area for like DIY technology,
Yeah.
right? It's like that's probably going to become big as well. Like you could see uh, like a non-tech guy, like just as how as hobby, like people get
Mm.
into like they make a table or something like that over a
Yeah.
weekend for fun. It's like I do think we would see non-tech people building small applications for their use, their friends'
Mm.
use, to cover all the scenarios that are not common and
Yeah.
mainstream, and it's more relevant for them. So that's my personal view that that's likely to be an area that's going to be significantly uh,
Yeah.
growing. Uh, and then also like on the interconnecting part, anything that kind of connects people without a lot of uh, leakage in the connection
Mm.
itself, right? Like uh, internet is a big disintermediary, right? It's like it kind of cuts out people who need to be
Mm.
middlemen, right? Like that's what internet has
Yeah.
been doing. We are halfway through the evolution in that, but it's like it probably needs to be a more connected system. Like it's like while e-commerce is a way to disintermediate like an entire supply
Yeah.
chain, uh, a marketplace is an intermediary,
Mm.
right? Like so, how would you have a truly disruptive interconnected system that can uh, get people
Yeah.
together, right? Like it's like anybody who needs to do a transaction with others who are interested in that
Yeah.
transaction. So I guess that's a big area. Like Web 3.0 is probably like in that
Yeah.
direction as well. So, but there are, I guess there are many ways in which it can be done. Web 3.0 is like one of
Mm.
those. That could be a big
Mm.
direction as well. Like open networks for bringing in various parties together to give value to an end
Yeah.
customer. Like I guess that's going to be a big area
Yeah.
as well.
Interesting. Yeah, I see a lot more companies, trying to adapt um, Web 3.0 and invest in that. So yeah, it's going to be
Hmm.
interesting to see what it
Yep.
evolves into. Great. So as you said, there are so many technologies out there. There is like open source is big right now, right? As compared to previous previous time, let's say 2000s. Mainly these proprietary softwares that were used, and nowadays it's mainly open source which is used, or a managed service which is built on top of like an open source software.
Hmm.
So we have, whenever we want to implement something, we have so many options to choose from, right? And then there is the other option where you can just build it, right? So how do we make that decision of choosing a particular technology versus building on our own? So I've seen it happening that
Hmm.
as a team we decided to kind of build it on our own. We spent more and more time, a lot of effort, and then we realized, oh, I think we made the wrong decision. We could have used this and be
Hmm.
added more value to the customer. And then also that we used the service right from the beginning, and then decided, oh, this is going to be very costly, and maybe now it makes sense to
Hmm.
build it on our own, and save some cost and be more flexible in what we
Right.
provide to our customers. So how do we make that decision, like buy versus build?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question that comes up multiple times, right? Like, and I don't think there is a single
Yeah.
right answer, but if you have to put in a framework as to like how we go about it, I think we probably start off with if you can buy, you should
Mm.
buy, right? It's like it's when I say if you can buy, it's like if you have a commercial software that actually meets the
Mm.
requirements that you have, right? It's uh, and typically that would be for requirements that are pretty
Mm.
generic, right? It's not something that is unique to your business model, or it's not something that's your fundamental
Mm.
strength. But it's something that is fairly common, right? Like if you want an accounting software, or like if you want a HR management software, like, there these are probably too generic, but there are always like requirements that are not very unique
Mm.
to you. In that case, I think you should always buy, right? Like I'm not sure if cost should be considered as a
Mm.
factor at all in this, because it's very unlikely that your build cost can
Mm.
eventually, in the long run, be lower than a
Yeah.
buy cost, right? Like if you can, right? That said, where the biggest gap comes in is in most cases, at a high level, things look like they meet your
Mm.
requirements, but when you go into depth, it does not meet your requirements, or you want to integrate it with like so many other systems. That's something to watch out for. Like, is the tool that you're looking for, is that something that is extensible? Is there integration options? Like, how do you get it to work with your
Mm.
ecosystem, right? Uh, so I would look at it as if you're buying the most important software for your business and you're not a tech company and it's you're looking for the most important software and you think something can work
Mm.
well, you should go with
Yeah.
that, right? But when you go for other software beyond that, compatibility with like your primary software is going to be a key requirement to look
Mm.
at, right? So that's going to be important. uh, but on the other hand, if you're a tech company or if you're like a core like tech is going to be your
Mm.
differentiator, then you may need to build to make it your
Mm.
differentiator, right? Like if you want to build tech in a way that's your proprietary IP and that's going to be your success factor, then it's important to
Mm.
build, right? It's not something that you can buy. Uh, so that's a way it can be
Yeah.
looked at. Like to put it in simple terms, you start off with like always wanting to buy, right? It's like, but really make sure that it can integrate with the rest of your systems and fits in well into your
Mm.
ecosystem, or it's a simple standalone requirement that just works off on its own, right? In that case, it's a clear
Yeah.
buy,
Yeah.
right? If it's something that needs to integrate with a lot of your existing systems, uh, then you'll probably have to be very careful in validating that it can actually be
Mm.
done, or you err on the side of caution and decide to build, right? But if you're looking at tech as being your
Mm.
differentiator and you think you can make a differentiated offering because of your in-house tech capability, then it has to
Yeah.
be built,
Yeah.
right? So that's probably the spectrum of how I would look at it. And just one thing, it's like from what I've seen from my experience, like for large enterprises, even something that looks like, oh, this is a generic
Mm.
requirement, so I could go and buy it, just because of the complexity in integrating with like various pieces in your
Mm.
ecosystems. Even if it's a generic requirement, if it's a small requirement, it's probably easier to build than to
Yeah.
buy, because your cost of integration and like getting systems to work together might end up being more complex than just building a simple
Yeah.
piece, if that's
Yeah.
what it is. Yeah, that's how I
Makes
look
sense.
at it.
So yeah, if I want to summarize what you said, I think the thumb rule is to look for buying options. If you can buy something, and then
Mhm.
if you grow into a company which is more and more tech oriented, you have the capacity to build something on your own, with which will add a lot more value. Then it's probably okay to think of building something and trying something, right? And I think this also boils down to
Right.
what is your uh, like what do you have enough room to try something new and then eventually even fail in doing that? So do you have that capacity, or you can build something more valuable for the customer, right? So that is also the decision we have to make. uh, Great. So I think this makes sense. So we tried to talk about like from an individual perspective in kind of our first
Mhm.
section. Now we talked a bit about technology. Let's talk about a little bit on the team side, right? So as a team,
Mhm.
we follow some process. Some teams are more process oriented, some are on the lighter side. Um, but there is one thing which I've seen happening a lot of times, that there is always tech debt that is building. So whenever we are doing something,
Mhm.
there's a tight deadline. There are product managers who want to get feature delivered, and then we kind of start living with these tech debts. And how do we
Right.
manage that? What in your experience really works well to keep the tech debt within a certain limit?
Yeah, I think tech debt has to be cleared. We don't really have an option in
Yeah.
that, right? It's like you don't want the system to fall over a period
Yeah.
of time. Uh, but if a lot of tech debt is accumulating, then there's probably something wrong in the way it's
Yeah.
being done, right? It's to your example of like because of deadline, uh, I do believe that it's in most cases it's not the deadline that really results in the tech debt being
Mm.
created. It's because there was not enough thought going into how it could have
Yeah.
been
Yeah.
done, right? It's like, and that's not something that's going to take. It's not implementation time. It's not going to take
Yeah.
a lot of time. It's like putting in a little bit more thought as to how can it be done in a step by step and extensible
Mm.
way, right? So that it's like it's incrementally
Mm.
built rather than building something that needs to be
Yeah.
scrapped off over a period of time and then replaced with better
Mm.
structure, right? Like, so tech debt uh, builds when it's not thought through and it's not
Mm.
modularized well. And it's if systems are modularized well and interfaces are clean, then tech debt does not build up as
Mm.
quickly, right? That is one. But of course, there are scenarios where tech debt builds up because of like deadline, where you needed a much more complex implementation, which would have been the best way to do it, and which would probably be the more
Yeah.
scalable way. But because today we are not going to scale immediately, you take a lighter
Yeah.
approach. That's the kind of tech debt that you need to fix. It's the problem is who's going to be pushing for that to
Mm.
be fixed, right? It's like it's never going to be a business team or a product owner who's going to push for that, right? So the ownership is completely on the engineering team side, right? To be able to pick up these. Usually, projects have like your cycles where there's a lot of urgency, and then there is phases where there's probably some lean
Mm.
time. That's a period to clear off. Uh, but the best would be to understand why there is tech debt accumulating. It shouldn't
Yeah.
accumulate too much. There is always tech debt, but like if it's accumulating too much at an alarming pace, uh, there's probably some gaps in the processes in the team and how decisions are being
Mm.
made, and maybe that needs to be
Mm.
looked at as
Yeah.
well.
That makes sense. And I think in some way there is also this risk factor which is attached to a tech debt, right? So if we are okay to live with a tech debt for let's say 1 month,
Hmm.
and it's not as risky to our customers and to our business, that might still be okay. But uh, what do you think? Like attaching risk to a tech debt, is it a good strategy to model that, or divide those tech debts into two classes where one is like, oh, this is really
Yeah.
urgent, let's do it right away. um, um,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, that's a good model because instead of implicitly understanding that and making your prioritization, like if that's there, that probably like let's say there's a sprint planning meeting and it's like the tech team really wants to push in
Mm.
clearing a tech debt. How do you justify it to the business team that's asking for the next feature that they want to
Yeah.
sell out, right? It's like, and that's a healthy debate to have, right? So that's where I think explaining the risk associated with that
Mm.
tech debt would probably make the non-tech people in the discussion understand and appreciate why that needs to be addressed. Uh, yeah, so that would be a good idea to associate the risk associated with tech debt uh, as part of reviewing that and figuring out how you
Mm.
deal with that.
Yeah, that makes sense. um, I think so when we talk about risk, right? So as senior engineers, I've seen or I've heard this many times that as we grow in our careers, engineers are more and more responsible to mitigate those risks and early. So
Mm.
first is to identify and know that, oh, there is this risk, and then kind of document it and then work on the mitigation part. So what are some strategies that you have seen used to kind of not get into this situation where you are living with a risk and it can explode any time?
Uh, So the first part would be probably as we discussed, it's more on like making the right choices. Like even if there is a
Mm,
tight deadline, like how do you make it in a way that it's like a slightly thought through
mm,
decision, which enables you to incrementally build on top of it rather than needing to scrap up
mm,
something and build from scratch. So that kind of a thought process which helps you to like understand the direction you can take, that could be one way to look at it. And of course the keeping tab of the technical risks associated, right? And reviewing that along in your every sprint
mm.
planning meeting so that it's all your stakeholders are aware of
Yeah.
that. Because the typical problem is when nobody is aware of it, right? Because other than the development
Mm,
team, the other stakeholders may not even be aware of the tech
mm.
debt accumulation. And it becomes even more challenging if the team is churning,
Yeah.
right? It's like the developers who understand the risk, if they're not in the team anymore, uh, it becomes even more
Yeah.
challenging. So bringing in that visibility and like having the risk associated with that will probably be a good way to keep track of that and ensure that we don't end up in a messy
Yeah.
situation.
That makes sense. Yeah, great. So I think we have covered a lot of interesting and
Mhm.
insightful points, and you have shared like a lot of good, kind of thumb rules and key points to, focus on. Let's leave our audience with one tip that you would share. So I would like to, create these small groups. So one is the junior developer or a mid-sized developer, and the other one is a senior developer. And then there is people who work like at a staff principal role, or if they want to go on the manager side, right? So engineering manager, senior engineering manager, and so on. So what is your one tip that you will share for each of these classes of individuals?
Sure. I'll probably look at it more from, since we were talking about tech debt and design and all that, like
Yeah.
more from that direction. Uh, so starting off with the entry level engineer, the one tip and probably the most important one would probably be have a very strong learning mindset and understand everything that
Mm,
you do, right? It's like if you're implementing an API, understand how it's going to be used, who's going to use it, what's a request, what's a response, what should
yeah.
be there, and what's the scenarios associated with that. Be very open to learning and understanding every aspect of what you are directly involved in and
Yeah.
doing that. Right? So that would be for the entry engineers. At a mid level, focus on low level design
Mm,
quite a bit, right? Like a modularization, abstracting it into individual pieces, and each piece having its own clearly defined
mm,
responsibility, right? Like any module, uh, bringing in a lot of clarity
yeah.
around that, right? Like this is the responsibility of the module, and uh, having clean interfaces assigned with the responsibility of the module, right? And keeping that sacrosanct. Never building something for
Mm,
convenience, because that gets into your tech debt, right? Like, but if you're very strong with your concept of modularization, then you typically end up doing the right
yeah.
decisions. So that would be for the mid-level engineers, and going on to more senior engineers, principal engineers. Uh, Focusing on enterprise architecture, technology direction, uh, and becoming an industry expert in areas that they are
Mm,
looking at, right? It's not focusing on at a implementation level alone. Of course, that's
yeah.
important as well, but really thinking of as like, how do you make the system better? How do you conceptualize an ecosystem of modules working together to achieve what we are trying to look at, right? Like, because I think principal engineers should really be uh, proposing and like conceptualizing new
Mm,
ways of solving customer problems better, right?
yeah.
It's like they don't need to get into like identifying new customer problems or like identifying new customers, things like that. But whatever we are doing, like as we expand, and what's the evolution happening in that space, and how do you address that better? Like that's really because I think principal engineers should not just like should really look at like very strong technology solutions for end customer
Hmm.
problems, not just technology pieces and
Yeah.
design. And lastly, coming on to you
Yeah.
said managers, right? Like yeah, so managers, I guess, simple thing would be uh, getting things done, accomplishments with team productivity, right? It's like if you manage team productivity well, then that's going to uh, give quite a bit of rewards. So that's probably the biggest focus area for initial
Awesome.
managers.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Arsu, for all those interesting answers, and you gave like a very straightforward and direct answers to all my questions. Some of them very really hard, and and not like a very straight answer to that. But I think you added a lot of good insights and your experience into it, and I've learned a lot. I'm sure our viewers will also learn a lot from this session. So thanks also for joining us on this podcast today. And for our viewers, please smash that like button if you like my discussion with Arsu, and also subscribe to the channel. So great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cavalier. Great talking to you as well. Very interesting and engaging discussion with you. And thanks, everyone.
Thanks.